And this is a topic I'm really passionate about. I could do 10 lectures on this topic. I love it so much. But I've only been given 20 minutes to touch very lightly on this topic. And that's not to say I'm an expert in any way on this topic, but just that I'm very excited and honored to present today. So my name is Sam Toe. I'm from Chicago, and I grew up in a multicultural family. My father is Malaysian-born Chinese. My mother is an American of German and Austrian descent. And my parents married in UBF in the first UBF wedding in the US with two other couples. So I grew up in a predominantly Korean country, and I even had a Korean harmony living with me. And I grew up speaking a little bit of Korean along with my English. I married a Korean missionary. Her name's Anna. Here she is, together with my family. And so with all of that, I'm raising my Korean, American, German, Austrian, Malaysian, Chinese children here in Chicago. And in 2019, when the opportunity came to participate in the Intercultural Communications cohort through Wheaton College that missionary Luke mentioned, I was very happy to participate. And so most of what I have to share here is from what I learned in that cohort. My hope for this presentation is to share some of the implications of our culture on the way we communicate with each other. And this goes beyond speaking the native language. Speaking the native language is certainly the first step, but the next step is learning about how we communicate. And this is important because UBF is an international organization, and we all pray to co-work well in multicultural leadership teams. We also pray to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth, and to raise disciples among all nations, and to establish native leaders. To do these things, I believe we must be good intercultural communicators. And for the sake of my presentation, I've chosen John 1:14 as the key verse. It says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." This highlights the incarnational heart of our Father in heaven. In order to reach people, he sent his one and only Son into the world. He gave up his throne in heaven to be with his people. And in the spirit of Christ's incarnation, I pray we can have an open mind to understand the impact of culture on our communication styles. So what is culture? There's a lot of definitions, and missionary Luke Hong certainly touched on some of them, but I'll use a very simple definition that helps us frame culture as it pertains specifically to communication. Here's the definition I'll use. Culture is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the member of one group from another group. And these can be expressed in many ways. They can be expressed in customary beliefs and social forms and the material, physical traits, but also the communication style of a group. And so another way to think of it is culture is like software that runs the programs of our thoughts, speech, and actions, kind of behind the scenes. You don't really notice it. It's kind of automatic. And so I'd like to start with the story about Korean Air from a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers. Today, many people consider Korean Air to be one of the best and safest airlines in the world. And I would agree. I personally love flying Korean Air. I love the slippers you get when you're on the plane. I love the delicious airplane food, the bibimbap and the gochujang in a tube, and the little miyeokguk in a cup, and the super polite and pleasant flight attendants. I think we can all agree Korean Air is the best, and I always fly it when I can afford it. But did you know that in the late 90s, it was a different story? Korean Air had more plane crashes than any other major airline in the world at that time. So how is that possible? Well, in an airplane cockpit, where there is trouble, communication needs to be direct and quick. But this wasn't always easy when a lower ranked officer needed to correct an error from a higher ranked captain. So here's one example of the communication in a Korean Air cockpit from 1997. This particular airplane is landing in Guam, where it's typically a very easy place to land a plane, and it usually has fairly stable weather. But that day there was a bad storm, so things were a little bit tense in the cockpit. The captain had just committed to a visual approach of the runway, which is just to say that he was going to land the airplane manually, which is very common and normal, but he had committed to do so before he had even seen the runway yet. Again, that wasn't necessarily that uncommon. But the first officer felt a little bit uncomfortable, maybe, and so he decides to say something. And he says to the captain, "Don't you think it rains more in this area here?" What do you think he's trying to communicate to the captain? Remember, this is an urgent situation. But when I see those words, to me, it's a little bit of a confusing question when we're kind of trying to focus on a problem. And it doesn't seem very helpful when dealing with a very stressful situation, especially because actually the statement's not necessarily true. Well, when other pilots reviewed the black box communications, they believe what the first officer was trying to say to the captain was, the weather outside is terrible. A visual approach is a bad idea. So here you can see the communication style. It was in the form of a question that seems to be hinting something, but the captain actually didn't receive the message. So the first officer would never say anything else about the weather. But a little bit later, a first engineer who's responsible for tracking the weather, he says to the captain, "Captain, the weather radar has helped us a lot." When I look at that statement, it feels like another not so helpful statement. It's about something kind of obvious about one of the many helpful tools inside of a cockpit. But the pilots agreed that what he was trying to say is a visual approach is a bad idea. Look at the weather. There is trouble ahead. Actually, both the first officer and the engineer wanted to abort the landing and regroup. It was just taking too much time to express what they had in mind in a bad storm, and when they can't see anything, they couldn't even see the ground. Moments later, the plane crashed into the side of the hill that the captain mistook for the runway. Now, these types of communications were the cause of almost all Korean airplane crashes. So how did they overcome this to become the best airline and the safest airline in the world? Their solution is what's fascinating to me. They decided that airplane pilots should speak English in the cockpit. This isn't to say English language is better than the Korean language, but it points to Korea's culture, that is an honor culture, with a large power distance and indirect communication style. So in Korean, you are obliged to be differential towards your elders and superiors with your words in your speech. That can make it difficult to communicate directly and quickly, especially when that elder or superior is in error. So speaking a language other than Korean allowed the lower ranked people in the cockpit to more comfortably speak directly without feeling disrespectful to the captain. And so sometimes our communication can be funny or silly, but sometimes it can have much greater consequences. In the case of Korean Air, these were deadly plane crashes. And I share this example to show that when we acknowledge our own culture's influence on our communication style, it can be very helpful for international mission organizations like ourselves. When we're not mindful of our own culture and the culture of the people we serve, we increase the likelihood of miscommunications at best, and sometimes serious personal wounds at worst. And so I'd like to highlight 4 cultural dimensions that influence communication through a personal story. Now, I grew up in Chicago UBF, and as I said, I was the oldest American second gen. So I have countless stories to tell of silly miscommunications and unintended ruffled feathers and even hurt feelings in my years growing up in the church and growing into leadership roles. Inevitably, of course, I caused trouble from time to time. I'm sorry, Pastor Ron, he was always stuck in the middle of these troubles I caused. But the story I share is a candid story. And so I hope that as I share, you would understand that I deeply and sincerely respect the leaders, pastors, and elders in my church, Chicago UBF. So here's the story. At one point, there were some concerns about me and how I was leading my ministry, specifically HBF ministry for high school students. One of the leaders in our church brought up his concerns at the elders meeting. He then asked one of the other elders to speak to me about his concerns. So this elder called me on behalf of this leader and expressed the leader's concerns to me. I felt it was odd, so I asked for permission to call the leader directly so that we can dialogue and understand each other. When I called this leader, he was quick to dismiss his concerns, and he even seemed to make light of them, even apologizing to me. So I thought the issue was resolved. A couple months later, though, the issue came up again, and the same scenario played itself out. The leader spoke to the elders, and he asked one of the elders to speak to me, and I asked for permission to call this leader directly. This time more emotion and direct words came out, and we both ended up being a little bit hurt. In retrospect, I learned that my communication style was in great contrast to this leader's. And so with this story in mind, I'd like to share 4 cultural communication dimensions that impacted our miscommunication. There's actually several more. This is from a book, Effective Intercultural Communication, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on these 4. And the 4 intercultural communication dimensions are: 1, high power distance versus low power distance; 2, justice versus honor; 3, high context versus low context; and 4, individualism versus collectivism. So first, high power distance versus low power distance. So this refers to how cultures deal with distinctions between people, especially in regards to how access to power and their level of status affects their relationship. People of cultures of large power distance believe in having a social order, where each person has a rightful and protected place in a very clearly defined hierarchy. So these cultures idealize the maintenance of power and titles. Okay. Cultures with small power distance believe in minimizing social class inequalities, reducing hierarchical organizational structures, and using power only for specific intended purposes. And so power distance might best be understood when we look at leadership within an organization. So Erin Meyer speaks about this in her book, The Culture Map. She provides scales to understand how different countries compare to each other. And here's her scale on leading. On one end, there is egalitarian leadership, and on the other end, you can see the hierarchical leadership. In an egalitarian leadership structure, the ideal distance between a boss and subordinate is very low. The organization structures are very flat. So like in countries like Denmark and Netherlands and Sweden, there may be leaders of organizations, but in terms of power and decision-making, they're very flat. They consider themselves equals. But on the other end, in more hierarchical cultures, the ideal distance between a boss and a subordinate is very high. And so in countries like Japan and Korea and Nigeria, the best boss is a strong director who leads from the front, and status is important. In egalitarian cultures, some might consider this type of leadership to be kind of like micromanaging and overpowering and suffocating. And so to go back to my personal story, at that time, I had been intentionally going away from using titles like shepherd and missionary. I personally have a very low power distance, unusually low. And for me, as I got older, I felt it more respectful and intimate to be able to refer to people, even my elders, by their first names. Personally, I just like being called Sam. I prefer not to have any titles in front of my name. But I remember when my wife, Anna, when she first joined HBF from Korea, she was shocked when high school students would call me dude instead of Shepherd Sam. This deeply offended her. It was almost like a spiritual problem to her and our children. But for me, it didn't bother me, and it doesn't bother me at all. But again, I have a very unusually low power distance. And in UBF, I noticed we love titles. So much so that I've noticed that husband and wife refer to each other by titles sometimes, even in the intimate family settings. So growing up, my mom even referred to my dad as Dr. Ben or Dr. Toe even when we're just talking as a family. So I found a funny picture my little brother drew of his parents. And here's what he drew. According to his picture, his parents are Mommy and Dr. Toe. Those are his parents. That's how much even my parents were influenced by UBF's culture and use of titles. So when I began to speak to some of my elders and leaders by first name only, though that felt very natural and actually respectful for me, this was actually felt very disrespectful to them. I've since learned that I should respect people and their personal preferences regarding their titles. It doesn't matter what culture or country they're from. It is appropriate to ask, how would you like to be called? Or, would you like me to refer to you as Dr. Such and Such or Pastor or whatever? Because titles are not a trivial matter. They mean a lot. So by acknowledging and accepting people's titles, it shows my respect for the hierarchical structures that are a part of their cultural programming and are important to them. So the second intercultural communication dimension is justice versus honor. And in an honor culture, a person's honor or status is more important than truth. So when speaking to each other in a group setting, it's more important to maintain a person's integrity rather than to point out errors and risk making the person look bad. This is called saving face, or chemyeon. Justice cultures do not see the world in terms of personal status. The focus is on truth. Justice cultures communicate very directly, while honor cultures tend to be very indirect in their communication style, especially to their elders. And so this might best be understood when there's a disagreement. So Erin Meyer speaks about this in terms of being confrontational versus avoiding confrontation when you have a disagreement. If you notice in confrontational cultures, disagreement and debate is positive for the team and organization, and open confrontation is appropriate, and it actually does not negatively impact the relationship. It seemed to help build it up. But in cultures that avoid confrontation, those tend to be high honor cultures. And so disagreement and debate is negative, and open confrontation is inappropriate. It breaks harmony, and it negatively impacts the relationship, even more so when you are confronting your elders. In my story, I felt that if a leader had an issue with me, as a growing leader myself, they should be able to speak to me directly rather than ask someone else to speak on their behalf. I take no offense to being confronted if there's some issue. To me, it felt like I was being treated like a child with the indirect communication. But I've learned to see the beauty in honor cultures where saving face is important. By not confronting me directly, it's an expression of honor that says, I value the relationship and I honor you as a person. And these things I have an issue with, they're not as important as who you are as a person. I, on the other hand, was very confrontational by calling the leaders directly. And by not understanding honor, I could unintentionally offend and insult my leaders. So by understanding this cultural dimension, I can understand the importance of justice and honor and learn to communicate better in that context. The third intercultural communication dimension is high context versus low context. And this refers to our communication tendency to use verbal and nonverbal communication to get a message across. Low context communication cultures express meanings in the explicit words that we use. High context communication cultures expect the meaning to be found in the physical or internal context of the situation, and actually very little of its meaning is encoded explicitly in the words that they use to speak. So for Erin Meyer's scale, she has a low context versus high context. And as you can see, US is very low context. So good communication is meant to be precise and simple and clear. Okay, but on the other end, in countries like Japan, Korea, and Indonesia, high context cultures, good communication is sophisticated and nuanced and layered. Messages are both read between the lines, and you have to listen very carefully. In my story, when I spoke with the leader directly the first time, when I had asked for permission to call him, I was so surprised to hear his words of apology. I took them at face value and did not catch the subtle ways he wanted me to consider his position. Because I'm a very, very direct, low context communicator, which is just a technical way of saying I can be a little dense and a little slow. So I don't pick up more than the direct words that I hear. So I used to take great pride in the saying, you should mean what you say and say what you mean. I felt honestly that this was a sign of a mature person. But I've learned to respect high context communication styles, and it actually taught me to be a better listener. This one lesson has helped me to be a better husband to my Korean wife. So I remember one time early in our marriage that at the end of the day, my wife Anna was upset that I had not taken out the garbage, even though she felt she had asked me to do so. When I reflected, I could not recall her saying to me, please take out the garbage. I did remember her sigh in the kitchen, and I remember her complain that the kitchen became so cluttered and messy. I even remember her mentioning that the garbage can was full, but she never said to me, take out the garbage. So I didn't even know she wanted me to do so, and so I couldn't understand why she was upset. Okay, like I said, I can be a little dense and slow, but I prefer to say that I just have a very low context communication style, okay? And so, now I know when my wife sighs, I I have to pay very close attention to where she is and the context and what she sighed about so that I can understand what is she asking me to do here. This is an example of how we can learn to be better listeners when we understand, are we low context or high context communicators? The fourth and final intercultural communication dimension is individualism versus collectivism. And so this is how people define and understand who they are, whether primarily as independent units or primarily in relationship with others. Collectivistic cultures strongly consider their actions in light of what it makes their group look like. So their group might be their family or their church or their community or even their country. But individualistic cultures don't consider how their actions may affect their group. Collectivistic cultures value uniformity and are most comfortable in homogeneous settings. Individualistic cultures value uniqueness and individuality. So for this scale, I'm going to use the scale of concept of self from Figuring Foreigners Out by Craig Storty. And in this scale, you can see Americans are strongly individualistic, where Southeast Asia over here is more collectivistic in China. And I think it's interesting when you think about America's pride in being individualistic. It's on display, actually, and to our demise when dealing with the global pandemic. Because more collectivistic countries in Southeast Asia view the pandemic as a problem they can solve together as a group, as a country. And people are willing to forego their personal liberties and their individual freedoms for the sake of their country. So if I return to my story, the issue of concern came down to how I viewed our young people's Christian identity as I was serving them and raising them in HUF ministry. As an individualistic American, I encouraged individuality and self-discovery and diversity. But this lack of uniformity made some of our more collectivistic leaders in Chicago feel a little bit uncomfortable. I did not understand this cultural difference deeply at the time, so it was like mixing oil and water. We could not understand each other. But after some time to reflect and to discuss and dialogue, we could understand our cultural preferences. And at the end of the day, we actually wanted the same thing for the young people in our church. We wanted them to know Jesus. We wanted them to grow as gospel workers. We wanted them to serve God's kingdom purpose. They just expressed themselves a little bit different on the surface. And so I've grown to understand myself and my church and my wife and other cultures in general through learning about intercultural communication. So to conclude, I want to consider the implications of intercultural communication in cross-cultural student ministry. Because when we serve students, not only do we often have to overcome cultural differences, especially when we're missionaries, but we also have generational differences. Some people refer to me as a young leader, but I started college 20 years ago and I don't feel young anymore compared to them. So how can we better communicate with college students when we have so many barriers to overcome? And I think a good place to start is acknowledging three things. First is to acknowledge that we all have a cultural preference. And these preferences, as Missionary Luke mentioned, are programmed by our upbringing. These things influence, unintentionally, our natural impulsive actions, emotions, and thoughts. The second thing that we should acknowledge is that we have a confirmation bias that identifies and prefers and really likes the scriptures in the Bible that justify our own cultural preference. And when we have this bias, sometimes it causes us to elevate our cultural preference to an absolute value or to a greater principle that should be applied to all people, causing people to feel that their cultural preference is more biblical than another person's cultural preference, when that's not always the case. Finally, I hope we can start to acknowledge the need to be flexible, understanding, and gracious of others who have a different cultural programming. This starts with intentionally seeking to understand our own culture, and then begin to think about the culture of the people we are serving. If we can acknowledge these things, we can begin to improve our communication across cultures and ultimately make us better cross-cultural ministry workers. And so I strongly encourage missionaries and leaders, shepherds, Bible teachers, disciple makers, and all of us to reflect on our own personal culture and the impact of this on the way that we communicate. When we can understand our own communication styles, we can then begin to understand how it might be perceived and received by others. So finally, I return to my key verse. The incarnate Jesus was full of grace and truth. The way Jesus lived among us, the way he did his ministry, the way he died on the cross and rose again, his life was full of grace and full of truth. When I meditate on the practical application of intercultural communication is not just a life hack or even a missional strategy. It's a lifestyle change and a commitment to be more like Christ. This topic and the Wheaton cohort may have helped me understand cultural and communication principles, like knowledge that puffs up. But the more and more I learn the truth about myself and other people, I realize most of all, I need to be full of grace. Improving our intercultural communication skills is not just a matter of picking up some principles and knowledge, but it's actually about learning and embodying the grace of God in our own lives and better understanding ourselves. And this self-awareness helps us to understand others. This really is a lifetime commitment to becoming more and more like Christ. I pray that our commitment to growing in our intercultural communication will help all of us and help our ministry in UBF to grow in grace and truth, ultimately making us more effective gospel workers for the kingdom of God.